Look, it doesn't seem like there's much of a payoff for what maybe like people's most optimistic hopes would have been.
So recently, Dave Smith had a podcast where he talks about Trump's 100 days in office, his first 100 days, because we're nearing that point. So I can't wait to hear what he has to say about maybe Doge or immigration or the foreign policy, Israel and Ukraine, and how he would assess Trump's successes and failures up until this point. So let's watch and let's react. Like the video and subscribe to the channel.
We are approaching, I think either tomorrow or the next day is Donald Trump's 100th day in office, in the second term, that is. And I thought, while, there's been a lot going on in the news in those 100 days, and there's been a lot going on for me personally in the last few weeks, that was kind of a good opportunity to kind of zoom out and assess the first 100 days. And then, of course, a big part of that story is what one of the things you sent me, Rob, for the topics for the show today, is that in at least a couple of the more recent polls, Donald Trump's approval rating has pretty drastically declined. I think there was a CNN poll and maybe a Washington Post one that both had him at like 40%. This, of course, is coming only a few weeks or a couple months after he was pretty consistently having his highest approval numbers. Now, again,
and that's true. He did have very high approval ratings about 2 months ago. I'm not sure the extent to which I totally buy this, that they're that low right now. A lot of things can skew this, like sample size and such, but it is an interesting dynamic when you consider some of the things that have happened since then, like the tariffs and rescinding the tariffs, and how the war in Israel has progressed, how the war in Ukraine has progressed, and how Doge is operated. There are some dynamics that have shifted in that time.
And I'm not trying to you take all these polls with a grain of salt. I don't know exactly how accurate they are. I mean, clearly, as we've mentioned many times on the show before, it's there was something revealing about this last election cycle where the pollsters were constantly telling us this was a toss-up election, but yet all of the reporting since has indicated that the internal Democratic polls told you that Donald Trump was going to win every single swing state and the popular vote. So as I've said for a while, it's like, hey, how come we can't get polling that's as good as Kamala Harris's internal polling, which is kind of bizarre.
Because the corporate media are de facto agents of the state. That it's as simple as that, really, I think.
But regardless of that, I do think what they're measuring there is correct. Like, I'm not saying the numbers are exactly correct, but I do think that Donald Trump enjoyed his highest popularity when he first came in, and now he is right back to where he was, or perhaps even beneath where he was in his first term. So that's a kind of interesting, that's an interesting development 100 days into this. What do you think, Rob? Just kind of where you could take it wherever you want to, but we're 100 days into this thing, and it does seem like the at least kind of like the hope for the potential of what this administration could be has now met the reality of the direction the administration's going. I do look, there's always, I've noticed this a lot. I'm sure you have too, Rob. There's always a tendency that all of us have to guard against sometimes to act like, or to act as if what you want to see means it's also going to be popular. It's like, oh, Donald Trump would be, I see this all the time amongst hardcore libertarians, I remember I was, kind of gently making fun of Nick Gillespie once because he had some post about how if Donald Trump dropped all the culture war stuff and focused on the fiscal insanity of DC, he'd have way higher approval. Yeah, it's like, don't get me wrong, I kind of agree with your point, but for us to just project this onto the world, like you can't just pretend the world is the way you wish it was.
Yeah, I think I'm probably guilty of this to an extent, though I don't harbor any illusions that what I would want is necessarily popular, but I think Trump's base at the same time is disappointed to some extent on some things too that could have been improved. Specifically, I think when it came to slashing government and their desire for mass importations, none of which have really come to fruition in any substantial measure.
And I said to him, I said, yeah, no, I agree. I said, Matt Walsh, did okay with What Is a Woman, but if he really wanted to sell some tickets, he should make a documentary about deficit spending, because that's really what gets people moving. It's like, okay, there is also real life. However, so while guarding against that, I'm still kind of going to do the same thing here, but I think I'm accurate that I think that in a strange way, there is this disconnect between where Donald Trump's base is and where the Donald Trump administration is. Or I should even add there's a disconnect between where Donald Trump's base is, where Donald Trump's rhetoric is, and then where the actual policies are. And I think where Donald Trump's base is that they have a burning, very well-deserved, white-hot hatred for the ruling elite in the United States of America, that they correctly blame the establishment for ruining everything. I mean, just ruining everything, from getting everything wrong, getting fiscal policy wrong, monetary policy wrong, foreign policy wrong, all of COVID wrong, and lying, not even getting it wrong, but just lying about all of it. And there's also, I think, a very palatable recognition that severe crimes have been committed by the Biden and Obama administration. And now Donald Trump also, with his rhetoric, is pretty goddamn intense about this. Drain the swamp. Russiagate was a witch hunt. Everything Donald Trump says it goes along with this, and so that works really well on a campaign, because your base hates the establishment, and then you're feeding them lots of red meat about how you're going to be a revolutionary type figure. But then when it comes down to the details, there's really nothing revolutionary about anything in this administration. Now, there are certainly areas where it is preferable to the alternative, where he's a little bit better than the other guys would be in some areas, not all. But there's just something it's a recipe to be left not satisfied.
Yeah, totally agree with this. I mean, certainly compared to Kamala Harris and the status quo of Joe Biden, Trump does offer some things that have been good. To me, the two best things so far has been dismantling U.S. aid. And I know some people might jump out in the comments and tell me U.S. aid wasn't completely dismantled, and that's true. A small percentage of its employees were rolled into the State Department under Marco Rubio. But overall, that organization and that agency was dismantled, and that's a good thing, because that was the CIA's financial regime change arm that had been pumping money into these places where the U.S. wanted a regime change, including Ukraine, which was consummated by the U.S. government in 2014. And the other good thing I think he did was he unleashed the JFK files, which told us quite a bit more, actually. If you're into studying this sort of thing, maybe people picked up on it a little more than others, but it did actually satisfy the urgings of researchers on this to some extent, and showed the extent to which people within the CIA, including Arthur Schlesinger and in the JFK administration, were really upset about how the CIA had engaged in regime change operations overseas, had been accumulating too much power, and had been essentially acting out of control compared to what the elected officials wanted. That is very revealing, how his entire letter got unredacted for the first time.
Because you know what I mean? What the base really wants is something more radical than this. I would also, to get into a few specifics here, and again, this brings me no pleasure to say, but it does seem, so, full disclosure to everybody, I've said this before on the podcast, right? But when Doge was first created, I was excited about it because I went, well, if nothing else, And when it's created, when on the campaign, when Donald Trump was like, we're going to do this Doge thing and have Elon Musk be in charge of it, I was like, hey, if nothing else, this is going to get the ideas out there. And I think there's something really valuable in that. And I think there has been something very valuable in that. But at the same time, what I initially said was like, this isn't a real government department. I don't know. It can't really do anything. It's the Congress is still going to appropriate the spending. And so that's what you got to deal with. And as I've said publicly, I try not to reveal too much about private conversations, but I had dinner with Vivek Ramaswamy. This was back several months ago when he was still a part of Doge. And I expressed that feeling to him. And I was like, this is really cool, but it sure is a shame it's not a real government department or nothing, and you guys can't actually do anything. And he was like, dude, just wait. Me and Elon got some stuff that we're working on. And it did give me pause and to go, hey, have a little bit of humility. These are people who I think are much smarter and more successful than me. And hey, maybe they got some plans. There's a lot of brain power between Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, and a lot of money and a lot of influence. And like, hey, maybe they got something. So I tried to be kind of open to it. 100 days in now, and it pains me to say this, but it seems overwhelmingly clear that Doge failed. It just, none of this is live. I hope, I pray to eat these words. Nothing would make me happier than if I have to come back on the show at some point and go, I got that one wrong. It really did end up working out. But like, what are we talking about here? $2 trillion in cuts. Where are those cuts? Spending's going up. It's not going down. There's no cuts. There's negative cuts.
Yeah, this is so true. This is one of the most unfortunate things I think that's developed so far in this administration. I have no doubt that Elon Musk's desire was to cut that much spending. It was to curtail government. It was to slash it. And he was seen in cabinet meetings, like addressing the Trump administration, saying, hey, if we don't get this under wraps, America's going bankrupt. There's no solutions outside of cuts and spending cuts to that regard. And what we've seen is spending's gone up. The Trump administration supported a CR bill that continued Biden-level spending, including funding the organizations that Doge cut, like the Department of Education. Doge didn't cut the Department of Education, but some of its duties were taken away or moved to other agencies. And USAID, it continued to fund an agency that didn't exist because it was mostly dismantled. And Thomas Massie pointed this out and said, I'm not voting for it. It increases spending and maintains the Biden spending status quo. And he was totally dragged by it, by Trump and his fiercest political allies on Twitter. And it was him who's actually standing up for these cuts. Now, Doge on its website says that it's saved about $160 billion so far in terms of the cuts that it's been able to make in the executive branch. But the problem with that is, and that's great, I would never scoff at that. $160 billion is a lot of money. That's like 3/4 of the amount that the U.S. has sent to Ukraine so far. And of course, a lot of it's been laundered by domestic military industrial complex bomb makers and such, but $160 billion is a lot. But here's the problem, though. Spending continues to grow, and the Pentagon introduced its first $1 trillion proposed budget, which was about $160 billion on top of the last one that was passed anyways. So there's no net savings in the aggregate, and we're continue Biden-era spending. That's horrific.
Growth, And so, yes, a lot of hay was made about mostly about unimportant things, if I'm being completely honest. Like the most amount of noise was like, they're funding transgender goat studies in Lebanon or whatever. And it's like, none of that was really okay, it's insane that we're funding all of this shit. It's insane that we waste all of this money, but it's never like they even really mainstreamed the idea that like, no, we're fomenting coups in other countries against democratically elected governments, or we're, what I mean? It was like never like really got in to like the true criminality.
Yeah, some of that leaked out into the presses when they did dismantle USAID. and its operations in the Maidan coup and some other places. But he's right. Overall, that's been swept under the rug in favor of the, Lebanese goat herder stuff.
Of USAID or the National Endowment for Democracy or whatever. And, there was a lot of talk, but when it came down to it, Congress passes a CR that refunded like almost all the programs that Doge recommended cutting.
Right.
And then Donald Trump is there to smear Thomas Massie for being against it. And so, like, I don't know. So in terms of the Doge thing, kind of a complete failure.
And that's the thing. And with this new Pentagon budget that's $1 trillion and basically raises that budget as much as Doge claims to have saved, I suspect the same thing will happen. I suspect Rand Paul and Thomas Massie will vote against it, and those two will get dragged by the Republican establishment, including Trump's most loyal followers, despite the fact that they want to uphold the things that Trump rhetorically supported in the form of Doge, the things that Elon Musk supported, the things that Vivek supported, some of his acolytes that helped him get across the finish line, and a lot of Americans voted for him for.
I do think that, like, you're absolutely right in what you said, that that there Donald Trump has seemingly almost single-handedly, he has stopped the flow of migrants coming into the country, and that's a huge W. You can't take that one away from the Trump administration. That they get an A+ on. In terms of just the flow of people coming into the country, they get an A+ on it. Going from the highest ever to the lowest ever is pretty goddamn impressive. And okay, it was the highest ever a couple years ago, but still under the last administration.
So that issue I'm not admittedly that passionate about, but what's interesting about it to me is it doesn't seem like policy has really changed that much. Maybe there's stricter border enforcement to some extent, but a lot of it seems psychological, that people from other countries, including Mexico, don't want to risk that venture, that kind of life-threatening venture, to cross the border illegally when Trump's president. Now, he hasn't done any of the mass deportations that were rumored to have happened, that Vivek proposed, and really that'd be impossible. It's impossible to kind of hold him to that standard because there's apparently 35 million illegal immigrants by most estimates in the U.S., but instead he's kind of confined them to, a few hundred critics of Israel, some of which are here illegally, but he still wants to deport because of that, which that wasn't sold in the run-up to this election. But that's where he seems to be focused on, and not these mass deportations of, even criminals other than thought crimes for wanting to critique, America's closest ally. I put that in quotes.
And so they get credit for that. But it is, the more you look at it, I do think there's just like a lot of things that Donald Trump is doing that just aren't really what the base was looking for. And I think that, like, in terms of like deportations, I think the issue that most Trump supporters had was like, look, we don't even know how many illegal immigrants there are in the country. There's something in the ballpark of 30 to 50 million of them, somewhere in there, I think. We don't really know for sure. And it's kind of like, hey, they don't have a right to be here. They came here illegally and they should have to go. And then you have debates about, like, well, I guess we should start with the criminals, start with the gang members, start with this, and then, figure out how exactly to do this. But like, there was never really a consensus that, like, yes, we should be deporting legal residents who oppose Israel or something like that. That just wasn't like really what they were all about. And I definitely think that, like, it was pretty clear, while, don't get me wrong, while there's a lot of Trump's base who support Israel, I think overwhelmingly the Trump base did not want any more of this military adventurism. And he's conducted like a pretty serious bombing campaign in Yemen here. I think there's been, the last report I saw was there were around, I think, 100 people killed in the last few days.
Yeah, this isn't widely reported, but, the most infamous bombing happened in Yemen that led to, the signal leak, and that story kind of blew up for about a week or so. But really, the U.S. has continuously bombed Yemen since then. And what Dave's referring to is 98 Yemeni civilians died just this week. So they've continued to bomb Yemen and the Houthis in a campaign that will do nothing. These Houthis withstood a Saudi Arabian invasion for something like 7 years and a starvation blockade by the Saudis and the US for over a decade. These bombs are not going to do anything to subdue them. It's all for the service of Israel because the Yemenis support the Palestinians and wanted to put aid into Gaza that Israel doesn't want to be put in there.
Over this, and it's like, he never really sold this to the American people, never really had like a convincing argument of this is why we should go to war with Yemen.
And to the contrary, when he appeared on Tim Pool during his campaign, he ridiculed Biden for bombing Yemen for the same thing that he did. So not only was it not a mandate to do that, Trump kind of doubled down on the policy that he mocked Biden for doing.
Listen, as I've said before on the show, he does seem to have stood up to the Israelis to some degree about Iran. We could get into that a little bit more because there's some more updates on that. But it's constantly flirting with another war with Iran. And there's just like all of the craziness is back, you know, like all of the every day he says a crazy thing, this and that. It just doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like there's much of a payoff for what maybe like people's most optimistic hopes would have been. And then to your other point that you mentioned there, I mean, at this point, it seems overwhelmingly clear that there will be no punishment for any of the crimes that were committed at the highest levels of government. We're not getting anything. They're not, we'll release the JFK files minus all the redacted parts. We'll maybe release some of the Epstein stuff minus anything that you'd really want to see.
The Epstein files truly was probably the worst gambit that they played with, knowing that those binders would not reveal anything new that Americans hadn't seen before, but still making a big spectacle of it, or at least allowing it to become a spectacle by those influencers waving them around outside in front of the White House. And it just contained nothingness. We'll never probably get any of that, or any of what would be relevant, like the Epstein tapes, or, you know, things such as that. But Dave's right. It does seem that Trump did stand up to some extent to the Israel lobby on this Iran strike, and was persuaded in that direction by, according to that New York Times article, Tulsi Gabbard and J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth. But he also has kind of walked it back a little bit, because in an interview with Time Magazine that came out a few days ago, he remained non-committal as to whether, if Israel struck Iran, if the U.S. would participate or not. He was very, ambiguous and nebulous in his answer in that regard, and it's hard to know what's coming with Iran. I do hope a strike has been averted for a time. It does seem to be that he stood up to some extent, but I won't be fully convinced, especially because he was non-committal in that Time Magazine article.
There's just kind of like, at least this is very true from my perspective, but I do think this is a part of the reason why you're seeing his approval go down, is that it's just kind of like people had their hopes up. Donald Trump stoked that, like, really get your hopes up because this is going to be something. And then it's just kind of like, nah, it's really more of the same in most of these areas.
Yeah, I mostly agree with Dave here. When it comes to the COVID criminals and the Russiagate criminals, those guilty of shutting down society, bringing totalitarianism to the American doorstep in a way that it's never really happened before in my life, like, that's pretty crazy. And a lot of Trump supporters will say, well, hey, you're kind of being unfair to Trump because Biden pardoned a lot of those people anyways, like Fauci. And that's true. But a lot of people were not pardoned. There's still only one person that's ever been convicted under the Russiagate hoax, the agent that submitted the FISA warrant application and omitted that Carter Page was already working with the CIA. And none of the COVID criminals involved in setting the policies and invoking the Stratford Act and the Emergency Act that kind of gave the state governors cover to lock down their states. A lot of people say, well, hey, you know, the lockdowns only occurred at a state level, not at a federal level. But it's not really true, because like what happens in most things regarding our government, the federal government actually passed these invocated edicts that said, hey, these guidelines are going to be necessary under this, you know, 2 weeks to flatten the curve nonsense. And the governors took that and ran with it and said, hey, here's our justification. We can't do nothing about this. We have to do something. And that meant curfews and lockdowns and vaccine mandates and all sorts of nonsense, religious worship restrictions. For the first time in my life, it was so absurd. It truly was totalitarianism, and I'm not being facetious or hyperbolic about that. So overall, I'm relatively disappointed with Trump. I didn't have the highest hopes, but actually after 2 weeks, I was very pleased. We saw things moving in quick action. He pardoned Ross Ulbricht. He was tearing apart U.S. aid, which that didn't really seem planned. And Elon was in Doge. It looked like there was a positive direction going, and we weren't bombing any countries yet. You know, but Ukraine, I think, is the biggest disappointment so far, because he correctly had the right instincts when Zelensky went to the White House in entitled fashion and act like a mopey little dope. And Trump dressed him down in the best way. That was the best Trump I've ever seen, when he said, you're gambling with millions of lives. You don't have the cards. That is what we needed to see from someone who won election largely on a mandate to end that war. But then after withdrawing aid to Ukraine for a few days, he's restored it. Thankfully, he has began negotiations with Russia directly. That's what we need. But unless the U.S. withdraws all aid to Ukraine, which the Republicans, you know, kept beating the drum for during the campaign season, we're not going to get to that point. But I do want to hear what you guys think about Trump's first 100 days. Am I being too unfair, too harsh? Am I being too lenient with Trump in some regard? I would love to hear from you guys in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.